I want now to turn to the lessons of the COVID crisis. We've had this pandemic for a year, here in the United States at least, from March of 2020 to March of 2021. There have been winners and there have been losers, and there are lessons, and I want to go over them with you. Okay, I'm going to start with the losers because they're the majority, the vast majority. I'm not going to talk about those who got sick or who died. The numbers are huge, and you all know them. I want to focus here in the United States. That's what I know best. But much of what I'm about to say applies in many other parts of the world as well. So first, here in the United States, we have 20 million people, roughly, collecting unemployment compensation. That's a staggering number. These are people who have been unemployed some or all of the last year. They've used up whatever savings they have. They are living pinched, frightened lives because not only are they unemployed, they have no knowledge, no certainty, no support in answering the question, will a job be there for me when this pandemic is over? Will my employer have survived? Tens of thousands of employers are gone and are not coming back. They have told us so. Then there are the millions of Americans who have decided not to look for work anymore. They're not counted among the unemployed. They have, to use the technical language, left the labor force. They're not working anymore. They're eating, they're consuming, but they're not producing, which means those that are left and producing are not able to consume what they produce because that has to be transferred to those who are consuming but not producing, which is why we keep track of the size of our labor force and its relationship to the size of our population. Labor force participation rate is the number that measures what proportion of our adults are working, and that number has been negatively impacted by the pandemic, and that's on top of all of those unemployed people, because we only count you as unemployed if you are a member of the labor force without work. If you leave the labor force, stop looking, we don't count you as either employed or unemployed. Then there are the wages that have been impacted. People at the low wage level have been much more unemployed than people at higher wages. In general, those at higher wages were able to use their position in the labor force to keep working, to convert their work situation from in-person to distance, internet, all of that. The lower your wage, the less likely you had that flexibility or even had the resources to try to achieve that flexibility. So it has come down on millions of people whose wages have disappeared or fallen, either because the wage per hour was cut, or the number of hours were cut, or the number of days per week or month that they had a job. The suffering at the bottom of our economic ladder was and is staggering. We've also seen a kind of harshness at a time when some tried to suggest that a pandemic is a time for a community to come together, since we're all threatened by the disease. We're all threatened by the consequences of getting sick, that we will somehow work out a way to help one another, or to use the phrase that a number of leaders glibly threw around, we're, quote, all in this together. But of course, in a capitalist system, That never happens, and it didn't happen now either. So what am I meaning by all of this? Well, a struggle begins. The struggle is who's going to lose the most as the situation deteriorated after March of 2020. People who rented their home couldn't pay the rent anymore. Landlords who weren't getting their rents turned around and told the banks they owed money to they couldn't pay for the loans. They couldn't service their loans because their tenants weren't paying rent. It didn't just happen with individuals and families renting a place to live. It happened with stores and restaurants that were renting a place for their business. Commercial real estate went into the toilet right alongside residential real estate. Banks weren't getting repaid by commercial landlords. Malls in the United States, already in deep trouble, collapsed on a massive scale, with thousands and thousands of malls across the United States sitting empty, losing money, going bankrupt, left and right. Communities all across the United States weren't getting the taxes they need. Unemployed people don't pay income tax, they don't earn much income. Businesses that have closed or reduced pay little or no taxes. Here's then the absurdity of American capitalism. When you have high unemployment and high breakdown of jobs, which is what we've had this year, people need more government support and help to compensate for the collapsed economy. But because we pay less in taxes when we have unemployment, the government is uniquely less capable of providing the extra services that the economic downturn requires. This is upside down crazy way of organizing. You need the government to step up with resources, not to pull back. It's been so desperate that despite the fact that the taxes have been cut back, governments have had to step in because the private sector can't handle the situation yet again. And for those of you that think there's something reasonable about either libertarian or laissez-faire or let the private economy fix itself, you've been through a year where the private economy didn't fix anything. It wasn't prepared for the pandemic. It hadn't produced and stockpiled the tests, the ventilators, the masks, none of it. The government hadn't stepped in to compensate for the private sector, which is what we needed, but it didn't do that because it's trapped and captured by a private sector that fears having the government solve problems because it'll raise in the minds of all of us the notion, why are we letting the private sector do what it fails over and over again to do? The private electric company in California didn't take care of the forests, and so they had the worst fires in a century. The private electric companies in Texas didn't prepare for the cold weather, so they had a catastrophe of no water, no heat in a cold spell in Texas. The levels of failure here are catastrophic. Private capitalism a la United States is a disease-ridden collection of symptoms that I could go on. But I don't want to. Let's talk for a moment about who the winners were over the last year. And there were some. Let's be fair, let's be clear. If you were a lucky company, the pandemic made money for you, and it's just about luck. Nobody created the pandemic. Nobody set out to do it, despite Mr. Trump's effort to raise such an idea. But if you're a company that delivers things, if you're a package delivery company, let me pick one. Let's see. Oh, yeah, Amazon. You made a lot of money because nobody can go to a store and nobody can go to a restaurant. Everything is ordered and delivered. And Amazon just lucked out, and its shares went up. And its chairman, Mr. Jeffrey Bezos, saw his $130 billion, he's one of a few hundred billionaires in America, go up to near $200 billion. Wow, lucky fellow. And he kept all that money for himself. He benefited from illness, sickness, and death in a pandemic. Did he propose to share that wealth? To say, for example, I have $130 billion, which makes me the third or fourth, or maybe even the second richest person in the country and among the 10 richest in the world. So I don't need to go to 200 billion. So I can take the extra 70 billion that I've gotten out of this sickness and death plague and help my fellow citizens. Did he do that? No, he didn't. And none of the other billionaires that I'm aware of, and certainly not most of them, did anything. They just collected the extra money. We may all be in this together, but they didn't hear about that memo, did they? The billionaires got richer to the tune of almost $1 trillion, while 20 million people are on unemployment insurance, using up their savings, leaning on their family and friends for the loans to keep them going, saying goodbye to the American dream if they still had hopes of acquiring it, of achieving it. Wow. You know how the billionaires do that? They move their money. They have advisors who say, don't leave your money over there because the pandemic's going to hurt that industry. Move your money over, sell those shares and use the money to buy those other shares. Though Amazon's going to do well, everybody's going to be on the internet all day long. What else are they going to have to do? So buy Apple, you get the picture? If you have liquid wealth like that, you can move it around. That's what stock markets are for. So the people rich enough to be on the stock market are rich enough to hire the advisors who will make sure that they keep their wealth or actually go one better, grow it, which is what the 600 billionaires in America did. So while the mass of people were worried about getting sick, were worried about their job, were worried about their hours, were worried about the debts they had accumulated, other people were laughing all the way to the bank. The rich got richer and everybody else either got poor or got sick or both. What kind of a society, what kind of a system responds to a viral pandemic in such a way? And even worse, what kind of a system that responds in that way has a population that allows it? Has a population, the majority of people are coming out on the short end of this stick, who are in the loser category. Why are they permitting it? I want to remind you all, in World Wars I and II, when something like this happened, when a war we were all in together was making some people rich while other people died on the battlefield or did without, the Congress of the United States passed what were called excess profits taxes, a special tax that said, if you're making money out of the war that's costing the lives of young men and women, you're going to have to give a large portion of that to Uncle Sam to help the larger society. Making profit off a war that other people are giving their lives for is outrageous, and we're not going to allow it. But we don't live in the America then. We live in an America now where the concentration of wealth at the top is so total that those people can buy enough of the Senate and enough of the House of Representatives to make sure not only that there's no excess profits tax this time around. Oh, it's fun to say the fight against COVID is like a war. Yeah, but not in that way. No, we're not going to tax people making money off this war. No, we're not. But again, the greed is such, the concentration of wealth at the top is such, that there won't even be the steps taken to help those at the bottom modestly. You must have noticed, but if you haven't, let me stress, that have twice already the $15 an hour minimum wage proposal has been defeated in the Congress. Already the proposal has been watered down, so it's $15 an hour, but only by 2025. You wouldn't want to help people too soon, would you? It's even worse in the sense that we have seen a kind of harshness, a kind of not only refusal to do anything with the wealth achieved at the price of pandemic, but even the desire to help those at the bottom has been constricted. Twice the effort to raise the minimum wage to $15 an hour has been defeated in the Congress. The proposal that is now still half alive wouldn't raise the rate to $15 an hour until the year 2025, by which time, of course, prices will have risen, so the real value of $15 then will be considerably less than what it is now. And the last time that the minimum wage was raised was in the year 2009. That's when it achieved the current level of $7.25 an hour, one of the lowest minimum wage rates in the industrialized world, or indeed in the world as a whole. It's extraordinary. Over those last 11 odd years, prices rose in this country every year. Sometimes only 1.5%, sometimes 2 or 3 or 4%. And every time the prices rose, the minimum wage stayed the same, so that what it could actually afford a person shrank. You'd think after 11 years of a declining real minimum wage, there wouldn't be this hesitation, but there is. So desperate are those at the top, they don't want anyone to touch anything. They don't want anyone to have any more money that might somehow, directly or indirectly, reduce the wealth they have already accumulated. And they work very hard to get the majority of people to somehow push against what it is that we all somewhere know ought to have been done. I want to pick up on this idea in yet another way. There should have been an alternative approach that we can now see would have made an enormous difference. From the beginning, there could have been and there should have been a recognition that we are now in a situation like and only like the Great Depression of the 1930s. In those years, starting in October of 1929 and running until 1941, the United States capitalist system had collapsed. The unemployment rate, when it reached a peak in 1933, was 25%. That means every family had either a mother, a father, a cousin, an uncle, an aunt, unemployed. And because there was no unemployment compensation, they leaned on one another at a time when nobody had much of anything. Or they went to a church bread line or a soup kitchen. That was the crisis. We have that kind of crisis now. The unemployment not quite as high, but then again, worse in the way that in the 1930s there was no public health crisis on top of a crashed capitalism. We have both a crashed capitalism, third crash in the 21st century, by the way, and a public health disaster at the same time in the same country. Okay, that level of unprecedented double crisis could have and should have led to the following idea. And I bring it up only to underscore the meaning of the fact that that idea was never brought up. Here we go. In the 1930s, what happened in reaction to the collapse of capitalism then was a massive, and this is crucial, redistribution of wealth. The wealth of those at the top shrank, and that cutting back of their wealth was the resource, was the way masses of people were helped. The ways that they were helped, I've enumerated them with you before. Once again, the Social Security system. We'd never had that in America before. If you reach the age of 65, the government will give you a pension check every month for as long as you live. Number two, if you lose your job through no fault of your own, and at that time there were tens of millions in that category, the government will give you a check every week for a year or two to help you through this crisis. Number three, the first time a minimum wage was passed in this country, in the depths of the Depression, just like Social Security, just like unemployment. And the fourth, a federal jobs program. 15 million, give or take, were hired by the federal government. They were no longer unemployed because they had a job with the government. They were no longer without income because the government paid them a decent income so they could keep their home and keep their rental payments or mortgage payments or whatever they had. Now, it was extraordinarily expensive for a Social Security program for all of the older people. And not only did it give the older people a decent retirement, but it meant they didn't have to be the kind of burden they would have had to be on their own kids, who were having the trouble of the Depression too. So it was helping everybody dramatically. So was the unemployment compensation. So was the minimum wage. And so were the 15 million government jobs. But the government, of course, didn't have the money to do these things. Why? Because tens of millions of people were unemployed. They didn't have any money to pay taxes with. They didn't have jobs that they required them to pay taxes on. They didn't have any income. Stores were shut. Factories were cut back or closed. Nobody was paying taxes, bluntly put. So where did the government get the value to provide massive support? And the answer is they redistributed wealth. They used taxes, they used loaned money, they used a variety of mechanisms. What's not important is the mechanisms. What is important is that if you look at the distribution of wealth in America, in 1929, it reverses what it had been doing in the entire period since the Civil War in this country, where the inequality had gotten worse and worse and worse. But after the great crash of 1929, it reversed. Inequality got less and less. The great crash prompted the use of the wealth of the richest to help everybody else. It didn't take away from the richest their position as the richest. They came out of the Great Depression, the richest in America, just like they went in. But they had to take a sizable portion of their wealth to help everybody else. And you know what that did? It produced in the United States a kind of solidarity, a kind of community. And one of the expressions of that solidarity and community was the feeling that the president at that time, Franklin Roosevelt, was a kind of special gift to America. He had presided over this remarkable, genuine sharing that helped the mass of people. Not everybody. People of color were not treated properly, which should surprise no one given this country's history. But nonetheless, a massive change. And people understood it. They understood it, and so they celebrated their leader. They returned Franklin Roosevelt, the president who had taxed and moved the wealth of the rich so that he could help the mass of people. He didn't overthrow capitalism. It wasn't what he was interested in. He was one himself. He came from that part of the community. He protected the wealthy too. But he demanded and got a redistribution of wealth from the top to the bottom and the middle. And the gratitude of the American people meant that Franklin Roosevelt was reelected president 3 times. No president in American history had ever experienced that. He was the most popular president in the history of the United States because he presided over a redistribution of wealth as the way to address, the fairest way to address a problem that the whole society was struggling with. The Great Depression followed immediately by World War II. Well, we have something comparable. One of those horrible, rare events. Another crash of capitalism. Unfortunately, that's not rare. We get that every 4 to 7 years. But a pandemic at the same time, that's a lot. The pandemic made the crash worse, and the crash contributed to the pandemic. But not Mr. Trump and not Mr. Biden have ever indicated any understanding or any intention to do what Mr. Roosevelt did. They may want to be president, and look how desperate Mr. Trump was, but they are not about to follow in the steps of the most successful president in American history, because they know who butters their bread. They know who calls the tune. They know who, in the end, they serve. And so we do not have it. Our inequality didn't go down. It got worse. It's not that they didn't do what Roosevelt did. They did, allowed to have happen, the opposite of what Mr. Roosevelt did. To wind this up, some people are hoping, and you see it in the financial press these days, that we are about to end the pandemic, that somehow the mask wearing and the vaccines, despite the behavior of politicians who are continually pandering to business interests by opposing the lockdowns that have worked so well in other countries, led in this country by Texas and Mississippi, behaving in ways that the rest of the world cannot believe as they watch it. There are people who look at all of this horror and say, well, we'll be out of the woods soon. We're going to have a boom when it's over. It's going to be like 1945, the end of World War II, which was followed by a bit of a boom in the United States. And so I want to conclude with a couple of observations, one of them about this boom mentality. I don't think a boom is coming. And it's not that I can predict the future. I cannot. Nobody can. But the conditions for 1945 are simply not here. And so there's very little reason to expect now what happened then. Then the United States people had been deprived of the ability to spend money for over 15 years, basically from 1929 through 1945. The Depression had denied them the ability to paint their house, buy another car, live, send their kids to college, any of it. There was no jobs, there was no income for none of it. And no sooner was the Depression kind of over, 41, but then the war made it impossible to get those things too, because the resources of the United States had been deflected for war production, guns and bullets and uniforms and ships and tanks and all of that. So in 1945, you had what's called pent-up demand that had accumulated for a long, long time. We have nothing like that. The demand here has been pent up for a year, not 15, and that's not even close. Here's the second reason. The level of debts that Americans have accumulated is much higher now than it was in 1945. Therefore, the money Americans can earn now is going to have to go to service their debt, especially if interest rates continue their recent rise. That's going to be very expensive. It's not going to leave all that much to be used to buy goods and services. So that pent-up demand, which hasn't been pent up more than a year, is going to be deflected into repaying huge levels of debt. Mortgage debt, ready? Automobile payment debt, credit card debt, student loan debt. The four huge debt burdens carried by the American people, way beyond what existed in 1945. I'm not done yet. Then there is the fact that in 1945, the United States had no economic competitor in the world. All the other countries that might have been competitors had been destroyed in the war. Germany, Japan, Britain, France, Russia, China, decimated by long wars that took their young people, that destroyed their factories, their transportation networks, the United States had no war on its territory other than the first act in Pearl Harbor. It fought elsewhere, not here. So when the war ended, the United States was in an absolutely unique position in the world. It isn't in that position now. Even if the American people did have a significant pent-up demand, and I don't think it will be there, but even if it were, a large part of it is going to go out of the country buying goods and services produced elsewhere, generating jobs elsewhere, providing income to those doing those jobs elsewhere, and nowhere more than in the People's Republic of China, which is now a major provider of American goods and services and a major, powerful competitor globally. We didn't have anything comparable to that back in 1945. So you put all these things together, and the talk about a boom when this pandemic is behind us is just that. Lots of talk, by people who are claiming some historical parallel that is not there. My last comment today, before we close, has to do with an interpretation of the events on January 6th. A remarkable day that is still echoing and reverberating across both the United States and the larger world. The extreme right wing in the United States attacked the Capitol, where the Congress meets, killed a few people, destroyed lots of property, made a big noise, threatened a lot of people, including a lot of sitting representatives and so on. And there's been a search for them. Hundreds have been arrested since then. They are going to be charged and tried, etc. And I want to make a comment about all of that so that none of you, especially now I'm speaking to you outside the United States, miss the significance of that event. I could package it together with the Conservative Political Action Conference that happened a week or two ago in late February, but whether I do or not, the same comments apply. American capitalism is in decline. The symptoms are everywhere. The upsurge of the Me Too movement, making the gender relationship that has existed here for so long no longer tolerable. The Black Lives Matter movement, saying much the same about the horrible ongoing racial inequality and discrimination that this country suffers and reproduces. The fires in California I mentioned earlier. The collapse of the electricity system in Texas that I mentioned earlier. The fundamental fact of COVID, that the United States has 4% of the world's people and 20% of the world's deaths from COVID. A very rich country, a highly developed medical system, performed so badly. It tells you that it's not doctors we lack, or nurses, or factories that can make the masks, the ventilators. None of it is the system that's the sickness. It's the system that disables us from being able to use our wealth, to use our medical profession, to deal with the problems we have as a society. We put profit first. Profit is the bottom line, and it's costing us everything. But as this system goes down, as U.S. capitalism declines, and again, let me stress, as I have before, the decline is the product of capitalism itself. No outside force is going on here. No one need look for it. Capitalism is a system in which capital looks for the most profitable outlet, the most profitable investment, the way to compete with others by being able to produce something at a lower price. Capitalists in America figured out since the 1970s that they can make more profit either by moving production to where the wages are much lower or by replacing high-cost workers with cheaper machines, automation, or by bringing in immigrants willing to work for less than native-born people, or varying combinations of all three. And the end result of doing that is why we have so many products coming into the United States from, example, People's Republic of China, where they are produced by subsidiaries of American companies or joint ventures by American and Chinese companies as much or more than by Chinese companies themselves. Capitalism is what developed these problems for the United States. The American workers who once had a good job but have been replaced by a job that was exported or a machine or an immigrant, they have to make sense of what happened to them. No one is helping them. No future is being worked out with them. They are being thrust aside, or in the language of the right wing, they are being canceled or replaced or thrown away. And they are upset about it. And those that are most upset about it, agonized about it, become raw material for right-wing politicians who have a nice, easy scapegoat to vent your anger on. Immigrants, women, people of color, foreigners of every kind, the Chinese, the Mexicans, the Canadians, everyone is cheating us, taking advantage of us, preying upon us, threatening us. Look at it. It's like a bad film. And those are the people who attack the Capitol because it's a very small step to demonize the Democrats as the ones who've allowed the Mexicans and the Canadians and the Iranians and the Chinese, whatever, the fantasies of Trump, QAnon, and everything in between. But on the left, it's also happening. The workers in Alabama trying for the first time to organize an Amazon warehouse. The workers across the country who are showing all kinds of new militancy, new demands, making even President Biden remember what the law says about what an employer can or cannot do to discourage his workers from joining a union. You know what these are all about? These are signs that the middle of politics is disappearing. The center left, which is the Democratic Party, the center right, which is the Republican Party, the establishments of those two parties are losing their position, losing their control. On the right, you can see it already in the capture of the Republican Party, or most of it, by Trump, by the people who attacked the Capitol on January 6th. And the rest of the Republicans, the old establishment, doesn't know what to do, doesn't know whether it can hang on, doesn't know whether it'll stay inside the Republican Party or give that away. And then what? And you see it likewise on the left. The power, the energy, the innovative demand for change, that's coming from the left wing of the Democratic Party, from the forces of Bernie Sanders, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Cori Bush, and others emerging, a good number of whom do not shy away from the word socialist, which is a kind of watershed identification in American politics. They have not prevailed on the Democratic side the way the Trump right wing has prevailed on the Republican side, nor should that surprise anyone. The Republican Party has welcomed the right wing for a long time. It knew it needed them. It wanted to control them. It wanted to keep them as a junior partner, which it can't do anymore. But it always welcomed them. The Democratic Party did not. The Cold War meant that the Democratic Party felt it had to cleanse itself from anything that could possibly link it to socialism, Marxism, communism, or anything like it. So their hostility to their own left wing has kept it repressed most of the last 75 years. So, of course, It's more difficult. It'll take longer for the left. But make no mistake, the polarization continues. The January 6th event is a signpost of that polarization. The number of Republican politicians who had to support it, who have supported it since, who have supported the most extreme articulations, tells you they have to, or their political careers are over. We have not had that in the United States for a long time. That polarization continues on the left and the right, and it will change American politics just as much as the economic disintegration of the post-war period created this very split in politics. This is a society that is falling apart. And I don't say that with pleasure, and I don't say that with drama. I say it as an analytic observation of all these events crashing in around us. We are going to be changing as a society in the years to come in ways and at paces we're mostly not prepared for. And given the role of the United States in the world, the least we can do is talk about it, put it out there, and ask ourselves, which I'm doing with you now, what are the implications of the reality that the very survival of U.S. capitalism is coming on to today's historical agenda? The center is not holding. And it's not only the political center. When social media giants, Twitter, Facebook, any of them, begin to say we can't let the extremes, left or right, speak. We cannot they are also trying to hold on to the middle, which is no surprise, because it has been the rule of the middle that brought us to this crisis. So their instinctual reaction, if I may quote Mr. Biden about his own presidency, their instinctual reaction is, we just want to get back to normal, where normal means before Trump, before the center collapsed. And so sadly, I have to tell them as my closing comment, if you are making the catastrophic mistake of going back to normal, you're going back to the very system and processes that brought this collapse, that brought Trump to power, that brought the difficulties for the middle. What you should have done is recognize what Roosevelt did. If you really want to hold on to capitalism, then the capitalists are going to have to pay the kind of price Roosevelt got out of them, a dramatic redistribution of wealth and power downward. And the irony is, if you don't do that, which the left forced you to do in the 30s, now that the left has not been able to recover yet, if you don't do it yourself, you condemn yourself to your own historical extinction. This is Richard Wolf. On behalf of Democracy at Work, I want to thank you all for your participation. And once again, if you can, support what we do, talks like this. It will be enormously appreciated by all of us, and allow all this to continue. And I hope to speak with you again 2 months from now.